You went out.
Yes.
And what time did you return?
Well, I didn't get back until about 9:30. I just made myself a drink and I was going to my room when I heard a screaming and a banging. The sound was coming from the back of the house, and I walked along the corridor, and it was the old scullery, the so-called scullery. It's now being made into a playroom, but the builders have left it half-finished, the way builders often do. And then I heard another noise, so I called out, "Who's in there?" And Tom sobbed out to me, "Miss, will I have to stay in here forever?" So I asked him how long he'd been there, and then he screamed at me, "Go away, go away." Now, Tom has never, ever, ever shown any aggression towards me. We've, in 2 years, built up a very strong relationship.
So what did you do next?
I tried to open the door and I couldn't, so I went down to Mr. Cardy's study, but he wasn't there.
Mr. Cardy is not resident in the building?
No, he lives in a cottage on the estate.
So your natural assumption on finding Tom locked in the scullery and Mr. Cardy not in his study was that Mr. Cardy had gone home for the night and Tom was to spend the night locked up?
But I wasn't going to let that happen. I went to Matron and she said, "Oh, he's got to be taught a lesson." I asked if he'd been fed and she said he had, and then she just slammed her door. So I went back to the room where Tom was and I listened. It was very quiet, and then suddenly I heard, it was just like a howl of an animal. So I rang Mr. Harrison, the social worker, and he came over right away.
And did he manage to get the boy out?
Yes.
And what condition did you find Tom in?
The room was unheated and there was no light. The bulb was broken. So I went and got another bulb and put it in. And Tom looked absolutely terrible. He was sitting under a table covered in cement dust. His hands were all bleeding. His nails were broken. He must have been scrabbling at the door or the cement, I don't know which. The social worker and I were very, very shocked.
So you called the police?
He had no choice.
The boy had been locked in a dark room with no heating from 11 o'clock in the morning till nearly 10 o'clock at night. Had he been fed?
There was a plate on the floor. It looked as though someone had been feeding a dog.
Thank you, Mrs. Piper.
Yes, that's very emotive, Mrs. Piper. It looked as though someone had been feeding a dog. Why did you say that?
Because that's what it looked like.
Well, a plate on the floor is a plate on the floor, and denotes no more. You're not saying as well as the alleged ill treatment that Douglas Cardy was trying to starve the boy.
No.
So you're not suggesting that Douglas Cardy is some sort of decadent creature, such as the Third Reich might have thrown up?
Of course I'm not.
Well, I'm glad your emotive imagery knows some bounds, Mrs. Piper. Now, after the boy being left in the room for some 10 hours, is it not true that Mr. Cardy had the boy in his study for several hours throughout the day?
I believe so.
Yes, he had the boy in his study after lunch, he had the boy in his study at tea time, and later that evening. And on each occasion, he asked Tom for his promise that he wouldn't turn on taps or break windows or do anything disruptive, and Tom just grinned.
I was not in the study, so I do not know what happened.
Now, my learned friend said that you were a teacher at Laston Home.
Yes.
In fact, you're a deputy head.
Yes.
And the school wasn't generally up to your standards when you got there, was it?
The school was and is run on principles that I don't agree with.
Yes, indeed. Now, Tom Rigby was refused a place there while still at his last school because he threw tantrums and was a destructive influence.
I saw the psychiatrist report and I thought we could help him.
Yes, you thought you could do better than the previous school had done.
Well, I thought there was a chance.
Yes. Well, now, Mrs. Piper, you for 2 years trying your methods, and during that time, Mr. Cardy has been the model of patience, has he not?
Look, at the other school, Tom had nobody that he could relate to. He just got worse. But since he's been at Laston, he's formed a very good relationship of trust with some of the staff. He can go for months without tantrums. His epileptic fits are less. And he talks about his frustration instead of screaming.
Epileptic fits?
Well, there was a history of epilepsy, and he did have fits at first when he came to the school, but now they've almost completely stopped.
I see. Now, you've no doubt spent a great deal of time helping Tom.
A great deal of time.
Yes. At what expense to the others?
I hope none.
But isn't it true that several of the teachers have complained? They've complained that some of the more severely handicapped children, which you allowed into the school, are holding the more normal children back.
Some of the more reactionary teachers, perhaps.
Yes, and they complained about Tom Rigby because he was a threat to any kind of discipline.
Yes, but that got better. Laston is, after all, a school for mentally and physically handicapped children.
So in this case, you just took things firmly into your own hands and changed its basic policy.
Hardly. I've been there for 2 years and I made very little difference.
How much easier it would have been to change things if you had been head, would you agree?
Of course.
Yes, but you are not at the helm.
If you choose to use that emotive imagery.
Yes, you had the headmaster against you, you had some of the staff against you, and you had the system against you.
The system is not against me. The administration of Lassen is against my ideas, yes.
Yes, but the head of that administration is Douglas Cardy, and you are trying to discredit the head of that administration.
He mistreated a child. It's not a matter of personalities.
Yes, indeed. Now, you claim he dragged the boy across the room, slapped his face, and threw him in this colour rag.
Yes.
Now, the medical report shows that Tom's face was marked in no way whatsoever, not even a bruise.
Mr. Cardy is too clever for that.
Oh, you see. See, I put it to you, Mrs. Piper, that you have exaggerated this whole incident in order to get rid of Douglas Cardy.
No, that's not true.
You want to take his place.
Look, the afternoon that all this happened, I went for an interview for the job as head of a hospital for severely handicapped children. I have been accepted for the post.
So before going to Laston, you were at university.
After 14 years social work, I took a one-year university diploma course, yes.
So straight from a one-year course, you tried to take over from a man with 20 years' experience.
After 14 years social work and a one-year university diploma course, I suggested that we widen the range of children brought into the home.
Oh, yes, but you did more than suggest, Mrs. Piper. You wrote to the Board of Governors.
Yes.
You wrote to them after Douglas Cardy had seen Tom Rigby and refused him a place at the school.
I did.
And you didn't consult Mr. Cardy before writing?
No.
No. You also helped several other pupils to get a place who otherwise might not have got in.
A few, yes.
Yes, some of the more severely handicapped children.
Yes.
Mrs. Piper, is there a particular point in gathering together children with a wide range of different handicaps?
Oh, yes, because they can all contribute and make themselves into a community. Well, if you had a small group of people, you might have a cerebral palsied boy and a child with spina bifida, and in the same group you might have a Mongol and a severely subnormal child, and Tom Rigby could be in that group, sort of keeping his eye on things, his maladjustment being channeled in positive directions, you see. Now, all these children are called handicapped, but they can all do different things. Now, the cerebral palsied boy could perhaps read a story to this severely subnormal child, and the spina bifida boy could help the Mongol with a puzzle. Then say they got hungry, well, Tom could take the subnormal boy and they could find food together. You see, they all work together and they make a community of their own.
Thank you, Mrs. Piper. Yes, Mr. Parsons.
And wasn't the school like that when you got there?
It's not like that now.
Now, what is it like?
Well, a few different cases have been taken in, but on the whole it's the ones from the richer families with the simpler problems that get into the school.
So, Mrs. Piper, the freedom to choose the children they accept is the right of this residential special school?
Yes.
In all fairness, Mrs. Piper, Tom wasn't rejected because the people at Laston Home were wicked ogres. He was rejected on the grounds of insufficient specialist care to handle his case.
No, that
and the
isn't...
more severely handicapped children were rejected on the same grounds. Douglas Cardy knew from the very start that Tom Rigby should be placed in the correct sort of home where he could receive the proper care. It was you who forced your small change of the school. It was you who forced Douglas Cardy to take disciplinary action against the boy because you had introduced him into the school and it could be handled in no other way.
That is not true.
Well, was there any trouble at school before?
No.
Exactly.
Look, schools like Laston have to prove themselves to their patrons. If they take in too many rejects, they're a bad advertisement for their patrons. Mr. Cardy's creaming was so stringent that I once heard a mother say it would have been easier to get her son into Eton or Harrow.
I see. So you are also critical of the patrons of these schools?
They're too removed.
You paint a bleak picture.
The results of a system whereby the special schools reject the worst cases mean that all the rejects come together and they live in substandard conditions in long-term hospitals. In other words, they create ghettos in the hospitals.
It's a form of neglect, you mean?
I think it's criminal neglect.
Well, aren't we getting closer to the truth, Mrs. Piper?
I don't follow you.
Don't you? Don't you really, Mrs. Piper? The rejection of the more severe cases was close to criminal neglect, your own words. Don't you see, Mrs. Piper, it is not the defendant who is on trial here today, but from what you say, it is the system.
I'm not asking the questions, am I?
Yes, Mr. Parsons, you know as well as we do that it is the accused who is on trial. You would do better to confine yourself to the issues relating to the accused.
I thought I was, my lord.
If you would like to ask me what I think about locking up a maladjusted, cerebral palsied boy in a small, empty room, I'll tell you. And if you think it's idealistic to be appalled by that, I suggest you go home and look at yourself in the mirror.
Oh, dear me. Really, Mrs. Piper, you must not tell counsel for the defense what to do.
So you say that when you broke down this door, or rather when Mr. Harrison, social worker, broke down this door, you found the boy in the pitch black in a room without any heating.
You don't have to take my word for it. The social worker was there as well.
It was a cold night, was it?
I think so.
But the evening of September the 8th was in fact a particularly warm night. In fact, there was no heating anywhere in the school that night.
Well, it's just an impression. I remember it was cold.
You may have got the impression, Mrs. Piper, but the facts are against you.
Then I must be mistaken.
I see. Well, do you think you might be mistaken about anything else?
Such as?
Well, I mean, was Tom Rigby really screaming hysterically, or was he, well, shall we say, singing?
That's ridiculous.
Yes, but if I hadn't pointed out the truth to you about the temperature that evening, wouldn't you have said that my suggestion that it was a warm evening was also ridiculous?
Tom Rigby was screaming hysterically.
Quite sure you're not exaggerating?
I do not exaggerate.
Come, Mrs. Piper. The plate was on the floor as though a dog was about to be fed. The boy was in a room without heating on a particularly warm evening. There was no light. Now, what about the light?
What about it?
Well, what time did the light start to fade that night?
I'm sure you have the statistic, don't you?
As it happens, yes. The light started to fade at 8:30, right? You arrived there at 9:30.
What does that mean?
Well, there was a window, wasn't there?
It was boarded up. It had been smashed.
No, how was it smashed?
Tom broke it some weeks previously.
Oh, Tom broke it, did he? What, during one of the tantrums you have cured? I'm sorry, that you've nearly cured.
I said they were getting better.
Yes, you said he could go for several months without a tantrum.
Yes.
But when he did have a tantrum, I mean, he threw food at the house parents and at the other children. Now, he also, once or twice, turned the taps on before this flooding incident, am I right?
Yes.
Yes. Unfortunately, the matron keeps an eye on him for most of the time.
Yes, she does.
Well, I'm glad you at least admit the matron does her job well.
I didn't say that.
But she doesn't do her job well.
I don't agree with her methods.
So you don't get on with the matron either?
She worries too much about things being neat and tidy. There's never a toy out of place. Everything is numbered. The toothbrushes are numbered. Now, the children need a home that they can really, really belong to, not a bloody great institution.
Mrs. Piper, losing your temper is not going to help matters.
I'm sorry, my lord.
Very well.
So the turning on of the taps was not an isolated incident. It had happened before.
Yes.
Now, did Mr. Cardy punish the boy on these occasions?
He'd said he would be punished if it happened again.
Yes, so Mr. Cardy just didn't leap in and throw the boy in this corridor the first time something went wrong. He behaved like the headmaster of any such institution would do. He asked Tom that he mustn't do any more destructive things.
Yes, he did.
Yes, and on those former occasions, he allowed you to talk to the boy.
Yes.
So previously, when things had gone wrong, Douglas Cardy did not lose his temper.
He was quite angry.
Ah, but he did nothing.
No.
Yet on this occasion, you say, he tore into your room, screamed at you, and manhandled a cerebral palsied boy into the corridor.
I am only telling you what happened.
And he did all this without first asking the boy if he had turned the taps on.
Yes, he didn't speak to Tom until he was in the corridor with him.
The rooms at Larston School are quite large, aren't they?
Yes.
Where was Tom sitting?
Near the back of the class.
And Mr. Cardy went to the boy.
Yes.
So it is back to you.
Yes.
You see, in fact, Mr. Cardy said to the boy, "Did you turn on the taps?" And he replied, "Yes." Then Mr. Cardy asked the boy to go outside.
He did not say anything to Tom inside the classroom.
But it is back to you. Well, surely he was far enough away from you to have said something without you hearing.
Well, I suppose if he'd whispered...
So there is a possibility that Tom was asked about the taps while still in the classroom.
Well, yes. No, I don't think so. It's all so blurred. It happened very quickly.
Isn't it all a blur, Mrs. Piper? The pushing, the shoving, the shouting.
No, 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 just the details.
Well, where are we without details?
Look, somebody should have spoken to Tom.
Yes, but the boy knows the difference between right and wrong, doesn't he?
Yes.
One doesn't need to be a psychiatrist to know that your methods of having indulgent chats with the boy wasn't working. I would suggest to you that Tom was only really testing male authority the way some young men do. And to have been locked up for several periods and taken out for lengthy periods in Mr. Cardy's study and visited every hour doesn't seem to me to have been a great ordeal.
Tom was lying hysterical on a stone floor.
So you tell us.
The social worker was there too. He saw Tom.
I mean, I don't think anyone would deny the boy was dirty and dusty, but what else would you expect? He'd been playing all day in a dirty and dusty room.
He was exhausted. Both the social worker and I were very shocked. If we hadn't come, he'd have spent the night on that floor.
Ah, now, we only have your word for that against Mr. Cardy.
I am telling you the truth.
I see. Now, you phoned the social worker at 9:30.
Yes.
How did you know where to contact him?
I phoned him at his home.
At home? So, you and Mr. Harrison are friends, are you?
Well, we've met on the odd professional occasion, yes.
Yes, do you both like old films?
Yes.
Both go to Fulchester Film Society?
So do a lot of other people.
Play chess?
Yes, I played chess.
Who taught you how to play chess?
Colin Harrison.
Ah, so you really are very close friends.
Yes.
Well, it's only natural then, isn't it, that Mr. Harrison would see things from your point of view?
He would not change his opinion, his objective opinion, for a friendship.
Oh, is that why he came tearing over to the school? Is that why he broke down the door? Is that why he didn't contact Mr. Cardy?
It was an emergency.
Was Colin Harrison perhaps an intimate friend, Mrs. Piper? Mrs. Piper? Was Colin Harrison intimate?
I am sure that you have no right to... We are just friends.
And 3 years ago, you became separated from your husband, did you not?
We are just friends.
Tomorrow, we shall be returning to the Crown Court to hear further evidence in the case of the Queen against Cardy. In Fulchester Crown Court, Mrs. Helen Piper, the deputy head of Laston Residential Home for Handicapped Children, has told her version of what happened after a maladjusted child suffering from cerebral palsy turned on the taps in an upstairs bathroom, thereby causing flooding and damage. The headmaster, Mr. Douglas Cardy, then locked the boy up in a disused room and, according to Mrs. Piper, threatened him with 48 hours solitary confinement. As a result, Cardy stands charged with causing ill treatment to the boy, Thomas Rigby. Mr. Jeremy Parsons, QC, appears for his defence, and Mr. Jonathan Fry, QC, for the prosecution. The prosecution have just called to the witness box Mr. Colin Harrison, a social worker employed by the local authority. It was Harrison who helped to release the boy.
On the evening of September the 8th, did you receive a phone call from Mrs. Piper?
Yes, that's right. She told me Tom had been locked in a room. I got straight into my car and drove over.
And you arrived?
Oh, about 10. It's half an hour drive.
When you got there, but was the boy still locked in the room?
Yes, he was sitting under a table. I had to smash the lock with a hammer.
And did you find Tom Rigby inside?
Yes.
Was he frightened?
Well, he certainly seemed to be. And, of course, he'd been howling before I got there.
Mr. Harrison, we are only concerned with what you saw and heard. We are not concerned with what you were told.
Yes, my lord, but he was in a bit of a state.
Would you explain this state to us, please?
Well, he was covered in dust, he had blood on his hands, he'd torn his fingernails. He must have been clawing at the flagstone floor or something.
Or perhaps he'd been making desperate efforts to open the door.
My lord.
Mr. Fry, You must not indulge in supposition. And you must not suggest to the witness the answer that you want.
I'm sorry, my lord.
I really shouldn't have to remind you.
Indeed not, my lord. You say the boy was frightened.
Of course he was. If Mr. Cardy had kept to his promise and kept him locked up for 48 hours, that boy would have come to a great deal of harm.
I thought that again is hearsay evidence.
Mr. Harrison, did you hear Mr. Cardy say that he was going to lock that boy in that room for 48 hours?
So he didn't say to me, my lord, but...
Then you do not know for a fact that Mr. Cardy said any such thing?
No, my lord.
Not. You took the boy home with you that evening.
Yes, I did.
How was he in the car?
On the way home, he had an epileptic fit.
Now, Mr. Harrison, in your work, you deal particularly with disabled children.
Yes?
Would you say that even if the boy had been let out of the room by 10 o'clock at night, he should never have been locked in there on his own in the first place?
No, he shouldn't.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison.
Mr. Harrison, you are saying that at any moment during his time in that room, the boy, Tom Rigby, might have had an epileptic fit?
Yes, my lord.
Well, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Cardy wasn't in the habit of locking boys in rooms, was he?
No.
No, of course not. I mean, you don't keep a job like his for 20 years if you're some sort of sadist, do you?
No, but sometimes things happen.
Yes. And are you aware of the fact that Tom Rigby hasn't suffered an epileptic attack for the past 18 months?
Yes.
Yes. So I expect you would agree that an epileptic fit was not uppermost in Mr. Cardy's mind when he was punishing the boy.
I suppose not.
Well, sure what happened to Tom in the car was an epileptic fit.
Oh, quite sure.
A mild one.
Yes.
Convulsions, rather.
No.
You're not a doctor, are you?
No.
Oh, I see. Has Tom Rigby had convulsions before?
No, in the past he's had psychomotor seizures.
Oh, I see. Well, what happens there?
Oh, there's a clouding of the consciousness accompanied by automatic movements that often seem quite purposeful, such as walking, chewing, moving about a room. It's quite easy to confuse this with emotionally disturbed behavior.
What did Tom do in the car?
He wound the window up and down several dozen times.
Ah. And how did you treat this condition?
I didn't. There's nothing you can do. You just have to wait till the boy comes out of it, that's all.
So Tom was in no danger of hurting himself?
No.
No. And if he had suffered that type of epileptic attack whilst locked in the room, he still wouldn't have come to any harm?
As long as it was that sort of fit.
Now, why did you suggest, Mr. Harrison, that he might have done?
I didn't suggest it.
The boy shouldn't have been locked up because he was subject to epilepsy. That is what you told this court.
What I told this court was it wouldn't be very pleasant for him.
Exactly.
Ah. Well, now we all understand that, Mr. Harrison. Thank you. Why did you break into the school?
I didn't.
Well, you went in without speaking to Mr. Cardy. Wasn't that unethical?
Mr. Cardy wasn't at the home.
He was in the cottage not 5 minutes away.
I didn't know that. It was an emergency.
Yes, well, all the more reason for contacting Mr. Cardy. You were half an hour's drive away. He could have been in the room in 5 minutes.
It didn't occur to me. I wouldn't have thought he'd lock a boy up and then go home.
Miss, but when you got there, the boy wasn't screaming and shouting, was he?
No.
He had been fed?
Yes.
So apart from a torn nail and a bit of dirt, Tom wasn't in too bad a state.
He was tired and he was frightened.
How many visits have you paid to handicapped homes?
Several hundred visits.
Ever broken into one before and taken a boy away without telling the headmaster?
No, but I didn't break into the school. I only broke into the room.
Got carried away with your devotion to Mrs. Piper, did you?
Mrs. Piper has absolutely nothing to do with it. I am a social worker. I was using my professional judgments.
Well, let's look at some of your professional judgments. You've been employed as a social worker for 4 years.
Yes?
Where did you work before that? Mr. Harrison?
I was at the Laston home on the administrative side. I didn't like the way policy was shaping, so I left. That was before Mrs. Piper came.
Yes, Douglas Cardy was, of course, headmaster.
Yes?
Yes, and did Mr. Cardy ask you to leave?
I resigned. I disagreed over a matter of policy.
He did not resign voluntarily.
And
I
didn't
demanded
you
his resignation.
strike Mr.
Point
Cardy?
No! I There was a scuffle. I think my elbow caught him.
Quite sure it wasn't your fist, Mr. Harris.
I'm quite sure.
So you struck him with your elbow in the mouth and caused him to have 4 stitches in his lip?
I don't know anything about stitches.
An accident?
Yes.
No more questions, my lord.
Mr. Fry, do you wish to re-examine?
No, my lord.
Very well, Mr. Harrison, you may leave the witness box.
I call Dr. Olga Mansell.
Dr. Olga Mansell, please.
What is your
I
religion?
prefer to affirm. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Mansell, you're a consultant psychiatrist at the Fulchester General Hospital.
Correct?
When Tom Rigby was rejected by his former school, you examined him.
Correct.
What did you find?
In his former school, he wasn't able to relate to his environment or to any of the staff. He had become anxious. Anxiety occurs when there is a conflict between inner wishes and impulses on the one hand and the external world on the other.
But aren't we all prone to anxiety?
Yes, but mostly we are able to cope, to some extent at least. You see, children who suffer chronic or recurrent physical handicaps are somewhat prone to develop psychiatric disorders. This was the case with Tom Rigby. He was unable to repress his anxiety, and so he had become maladjusted.
One moment before you go on. Dr. Mansell, would you define the term maladjusted?
One can't define it, except in pragmatic terms. It doesn't always show itself in repressed or troublesome conduct. Often quiet and passive behavior can hide deep emotional experiences.
No.
But in Tom Rigby's case, it showed itself in violent behavior.
Correct.
And so you placed him at Laston School.
Not correct. I wrote the psychiatric report. It was the authority who placed him.
Quite so. And have you seen him since he's been at school?
Several times.
How did you find him?
Remarkable.
His condition had improved.
Very much so. His behavioural patterns were much altered.
What do you put this down to?
Tom Rigby was able to relate. Mrs. Piper had spent a great deal of time with him. You see, before this, the boy had been stuck in the animistic stage.
Dr. Mansell, would you explain that?
Well, it's a stage we all go through up to about 8 years of age. It's an egocentric stage, non-scientific. The wind blows because the child wants it to. Anything bad that happens is likely to be seen as a punishment in the child's mind because of the child's ego. If people quarrel, it is the child's fault in his mind. If his mother is ill, it is his fault. If his mother goes away, he has done something terrible. If someone close to him dies, it is his fault. He is responsible for everything. You see, when Tom Rigby was 6, his father left home and his mother couldn't cope, so he was taken into care. Now, he has blamed himself entirely for this, and his maladjusted behaviour has stemmed from that time.
Thank you, Doctor.
Doctor, what effect would ordinary discipline have on this condition?
Oh, an insecure or unhappy child who feels he has failed those he loved couldn't respond to ordinary discipline, because in this animistic state, all that would happen would be an increase of guilt and shame.
So it wouldn't help him to behave with more social responsibility?
No, the condition would grow worse. Adverse events can be harmful to these children when they arouse more anxiety than the child can cope with.
Had Mr. Cardy been made aware that Tom had this problem of regression into the animistic state?
Oh, yes, indeed. I visited him several weeks before Tom Rigby went to the school. I explained the condition in great detail.
Thank you, Doctor.
Dr. Mansell, is there a school of psychiatry that believes that the acting out of aggressions can be dangerous?
Yes.
So if I were...
but this case is a little more complicated than that.
Yes, well, you're quite right to put me in my place, Dr. Mansell, because I'm not quite sure that I understand, you see. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to go over what you said again, because somewhere along the line, you see, something wrong, isn't there?
Well, Mr. Parsons, if there is something wrong, do let us in on it.
I was just about to, my lord.
That will be a relief to all of us.
Now, you say that Tom Rigby was making remarkable progress. His behavioural patterns were changing.
Correct.
Yes. Now, I want to follow me very carefully. My learned friend asked you what effect normal discipline would have on the boy.
It would be worse than useless.
Yes, and Mr. Cardy knew this. That is why he allowed Mrs. Piper to try her methods of love and understanding for 2 years.
And it was because of this that the boy was recovering so marvellously.
Yes. Now, the boy had been well behaved for several months, but suddenly he broke down. He turned on the taps. Why? I mean, nothing had happened to him. He had been locked in the room. That came afterwards.
The punishment came after the act, yes. Tom Rigby knew he would be punished next time. I would say he turned on the taps because he wanted to be punished.
Dr. Menzel, has the boy told you why he should want to be punished?
I'm afraid he has said very little. In my opinion, he has had some sort of shock, a rejection of some sort. A favourite model aircraft broken, perhaps, or a quarrel with another child?
So, in a way, we have to look for the cause.
I would have thought so.
So the locking of the boy in the room had nothing to do with him regressing.
Some regression preceded the turning on of the taps, but being locked up could have had further regressive effects. And in any case, I see no point at all in treating a case like this in such a way.
Yes, but you've just told us that Tom Rigby was deliberately behaving in such a way so as to get himself punished. Now, Tom's a big boy, and even with his disability, he's a powerful boy. Might not Mr. Cardy's action of locking the boy in the room have prevented any further and even more violent attempts by the boy to get himself punished?
It was the action of a man who did not fully understand the situation.
Ah, yes, but from what you've just told us as compared to Mrs. Piper's evidence, the jury may well now feel that she didn't understand the situation either. You see, the whole point is this, really. Do you feel that discipline at last in school is any way out of the ordinary?
It's about the norm.
Yes, and is it not true that many headmasters have to deal with staff who are not properly trained to help the therapeutic rehabilitation of these children?
Yes,
Yes.
It's a lamentable state of affairs.
So given that situation, how many other headmasters, like Douglas Cardy, would have locked up Tom Rigby for a few hours?
If it was just for a few hours, I expect many would have done.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Mansell.
But that still doesn't make it a right thing to do.
You said that Tom had turned on the taps twice before. Now, Mr. Cardy, are you quite sure it was Tom who had turned on the taps this time?
Oh, no. Someone else might well have copied from his example. Anyway, I rushed upstairs to the bathroom. I had to splash ankle deep across the sink to turn the taps off. I then went down to Mrs. Piper's classroom.
What did you say to her?
I said to her, I think that pupil of yours may have done it again.
Did you shout this at her?
No.
But you were angry?
Inwardly, yes. But I don't believe in showing anger. Once you show anger, you lose discipline. I think you might say I was stern.
Yes. And how did Mrs. Piper react?
Well, she sighed and asked me what I was on about. I told her the taps had been turned on and the upper rooms were flooded. I said I thought we ought to give the boy a chance. It might not have been him at all. He was sitting near the top of the class, so I went up and spoke to him. I asked him if he turned the taps on. He stood up and grinned at me. I patted him on the shoulder and told him not to look so pleased with himself, and then asked him again. He said he had indeed turned on the taps. I then took him out of the classroom.
Yes. Did you take him by force?
No.
You didn't drag him from his seat, slap his face, and drag him across the room?
No, I did take hold of his right arm, but I didn't force him out.
Yes. Now, when you got the boy outside, what happened?
I asked him for an explanation. He just grinned. I said if he wouldn't answer me, I would certainly have to punish him. He just went on grinning.
Mm-hmm. And did Mrs. Piper follow you into the corridor?
Yes, she did. I apologized for breaking into her class. She started shouting something about calling for the police.
And was the boy having any difficulty with his breathing?
No.
He wasn't crying.
No, he was grinning.
And why was Mrs. Piper shouting?
I really have no idea. She tried to push me away. She told me to leave the boy alone. I replied that the boy was now my responsibility. And I said that it was I who would be criticized. When the governor saw the repair bill for the ceiling, I was sure it would come to several £100.
Yes, what was the bill eventually?
£350.
Yes. And what was Mrs. Piper's reaction when you told her that the boy was now your responsibility?
She asked me what I intended to do, and I said I was going to have to punish him. We then had a heated argument. I told her she wasn't in charge of the school yet. She replied she might be very soon, and that I might be booted out.
Booted out?
Yes, she was very angry. I don't think she quite knew what she was saying. Anyway, Tom went on grinning. So I said I was going to put him on his own for a bit. A couple of hours by himself, and I thought I might be able to talk to him.
Yes, did you at any time say that you were going to give him a spot of army discipline?
No.
Did you at any time out in the corridor say you were going to give him 48 hours solitary?
Laston isn't some sort of army barracks, you know.
No, you had no intention of locking the boy up for that long.
No, of course not. At 10 o'clock that night, I telephoned the matron and said I was on my way over. I arrived several minutes later.
Yes, and found Mr. Harrison.
Yes.
What was your reaction to discover that he'd broken into the school, broken down this door of the room that Tom had been locked in?
It's one of utter astonishment.
Yes, it was an improper thing to do.
Most certainly. Not illegal, of course, because he had come at the request of my deputy head. But, well, I was in my cottage, not 5 minutes away. He should have phoned me. He should have asked me what was going on.
Yes, so you're really surprised that he didn't phone you?
No.
You tell us why.
Well, Harrison had worked at the school some 5 years previously. We disagreed over some administration questions. I had to ask him to resign.
Yes. Did he take that well?
No, he did not.
How did he take it?
He threw a punch at me and cut my mouth open. I had to have a couple of stitches.
Oh. Did you prefer charges against him?
No.
Did he apologize?
No.
So both Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Piper were against the way that you were running Laston School?
They were.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Cardy.
Trying to make a conspiracy charge.
Yes. Now, you say you were going to talk to the boy at about 10 o'clock. You say you phoned the matron about it.
I did.
And you arrived there 5 or 6 minutes after Mr. Harrison had got the boy out of the room.
That's right.
Are you sure you phoned the matron?
What do you mean?
Well, Mr. Cardy, I'm suggesting that you didn't phone her at all. I'm suggesting that she phoned you to say that Mr. Harrison was at the school, which is why you arrived 5 minutes after him.
I phoned the matron.
I'm suggesting you'd gone home for the night, Mr. Cardy. I'm suggesting that Tom was to spend the night locked up.
That is simply not true.
He'd already been there from 2 until 10. Why not from 10 till 2?
He wasn't in the room the whole of the time. He was in my study on 3 occasions. And matron went into him each hour. I tried to get him to promise not to do anything else. He just grinned.
Had you any intention of ultimately letting him out?
Yes, of course. At bedtime, he was to be supervised in the bathroom. The bathroom was then to be locked, and I explained all this to matron.
Now, you've told us that you never lose your temper.
Very rarely.
I suggest that the morning of September the 8th was one of those rare occasions.
That is not so.
You don't think that locking that boy in that room was a fearful punishment?
Something had to be done.
Well, why didn't you just send him to his bedroom?
He shares with 2 other boys. One of them was ill in bed.
To another classroom?
They were fully occupied.
Couldn't somebody else have looked after him?
There were no spare staff available.
And so you locked him in a dark and dusty room?
There was nowhere else.
Well, Mr. Carter, the boy is asthmatic. Surely the psychiatrist had talked to you about his condition and the dangers
He'd already
of arousing
done
more anxiety than the boy
£350
could
worth
cope
of damage and had threatened to do it again. He needed a bit of firmness.
And you were firm, weren't you?
I wasn't going to stand for any silly nonsense.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means I know dumb insolence when I see it.
Because he grinned at you? Tell me, would you treat a boy like that? Would you march a boy around like that if he wasn't handicapped?
What the devil do you mean?
I'm asking Mr. Cardy if you would have dared treat Tom Rigby in the way you did if he hadn't been disabled.
Listen, young man, I could thrash someone like you any day, so don't let's have any more talk like that.
No need to lose your temper, Mr. Cardy. You lose authority when you do that, as somebody said earlier on. Oh, it was you, wasn't it? Tell me, by marching the boy out and locking him up, What were you hoping to achieve? We are, after all, human beings. Language and communication is what makes us unique.
I did talk to the boy. I had him in my study. I tried to get it out of him.
Tried to get what out of him?
His reason for turning on the taps.
And then you locked him up again. Did you think that was the way to get it out of him?
My lord, may I say what I feel about discipline?
Of course you may, Mr. Cardy.
Discipline is an ordered framework. Tom Rigby is relatively lucky. He should be able to make his way in the outside world, the ordinary world. If he's allowed to indulge in maladjusted nonsense, he will never be accepted anywhere.
So your answer was to suppress his outcry for the sake of conformity?
For the sake of social discipline.
Social discipline?
Yes. One thing the psychiatrist failed to mention was that although you cannot define maladjustment, except in pragmatic terms, you can define delinquency.
Mr. Cardy, are you saying that if the boy were in the outside world, he would in fact be delinquent and might possibly end up in a criminal court?
The line between maladjustment and delinquency, my lord, is often a narrow one.
Rubbish.
Miss Cardy, are you telling this court that locking that boy up was going to cure him?
I had given Mrs. Piper 2 years with her methods.
And you think she'd failed?
If she'd succeeded, this wouldn't have happened, would it? We wouldn't be here now.
The psychiatrist has stated that the boy was making a remarkable recovery. The fact is, Mr. Cardy, that Mrs. Piper was a thorn in your flesh, wasn't she?
Not at all.
You'd opposed her methods from the start. Are you quite sure that you weren't hoping that you would fail?
Well, that's ridiculous. What I'm saying is that you can't give a lot of attention to one without the other suffering.
But with the difficult cases, you have to spend more time.
I believe a boy like Tom Rigby should be helped towards independence. I think Mrs. Piper's attentions were having the reverse effect.
But the psychiatrist has stated that maladjusted children are not helped by ordinary discipline.
I have given them 2 years. I consider my actions to be correct.
Locking the boy in a filthy room.
Cement dust from the builders.
A room without light.
He could have broken the bulb himself.
A room with a stone floor and no bed.
It was never my intention the boy should spend the night in the room.
Wasn't it, Mr. Cardy? I put it to you that if that boy had gone on grinning at you, you would have said, right, I'll have no more of this dumb incident, you can spend the night in there. Isn't that what you would have done? Left him to curl up on that stone floor like some animal?
I did what I did for the good of the greater number. I know my job, and I have done nothing wrong.
So you say, Mr. Cardy. But the jury will decide.
Tomorrow we return to the Crown Court for the final stages in the case of the Queen against Cardy. Douglas Cardy, headmaster of the Laston Residential Home for Handicapped Children, is on trial accused of the ill-treatment of one of the pupils. It's been alleged that he intended to keep Tom Rigby, a cerebral palsied boy, locked up for 48 hours. The boy was released from the room by a social worker, Colin Harrison, and Helen Piper, the deputy head of the school. Both disliked Douglas Cardy and disagreed with his methods. Now called to the witness box is Miss Page, the matron at the home. Mr. Jeremy Parsons, QC, appears for the defence, and Mr. Jonathan Fry, QC, for the prosecution, in the case of the Queen against Cardy.
You live in at Laston School,
Yes.
and you've worked there for 4 years?
And 3 months.
And Miss Page, how long have you been nursing, and have you been in childcare altogether?
All my life.
Yes. And would you say that locking a child in a room is something that should be done every time a child misbehaves?
Certainly not. This was out of the ordinary. And Tom wasn't in the room the whole time. Even when he was, I went in to see that he was all right every now and then. And in any case, how else could Mr. Cardy stop Tom doing more damage?
What is your opinion of Mr. Cardy as a headmaster?
Excellent.
Yes. You think he does his job well?
There is no one I would rather work with.
Thank you, Miss Page.
Miss Page, what is your opinion of the psychiatrist's report, the one on Tom?
I think much too much is made of all this analysis.
You don't rate psychiatrists very highly.
They just come in and talk to the patient for a few hours. I mean, we do all the looking after, the real work, don't we?
Oh, yes, indeed. But generally speaking, I suppose things run pretty smoothly under Mr. Cardy.
Yes.
But when Mrs. Piper came, it was rather different.
Yes. We had to accept some children Mr. Cardy didn't want.
I suppose that rather upset the order.
Yes, it did. At first, it was almost impossible to keep the place tidy. You'd get different children throwing food about and playing with their toys at all hours.
I believe they started putting paint on the walls.
That was Mrs. Piper's idea.
You put a stop to that.
Certainly I did.
You didn't like the murals.
They used all sorts of colours, browns and reds. The walls looked dirty.
And now they're back to, what?
White.
Like a hospital.
Yes.
A bit impersonal, would you say?
Hygiene is more important.
But the paintings have remained on the walls of Mrs. Piper's classroom, haven't they?
Her classroom is her classroom.
Would you say that dealing with handicapped children makes you hard?
Not hard with the children. I would never do any harm to them. But it makes you sort of different. I don't know how, just sort of different.
Is that why you keep a pretty firm grip at Laston?
Things are well organised.
They are indeed. Why do you number the toothbrushes?
We number them because of hygiene.
Is it right that at meal times you tell the children to eat quickly and quietly?
Quite often.
Why?
So that things can be cleared up nice and early.
Oh, Miss Page, these children come to you with a variety of problems. Social problems, physical handicaps, rejection by parents. Surely they deserve love.
We look after them.
Do you have many friends, Miss Page?
No.
Do you have any friends?
I have my work.
Do you have any family?
No.
And you yourself were orphaned at an early age?
Yes.
And you were brought up in a large, old-style orphanage?
I was.
What was it like?
Like? These children have a marvellous time compared to me. They don't know they're born. They get sweets and toys and trips to the sea and parties. I think it's wicked to spoil a child. A sin. I never got anything like they got.
Is that why you won't let these children express themselves by painting murals on the walls?
Why should they muck up the walls? We never could. We could never touch anything.
When you were a child?
Yes. We were never allowed to paint walls. One toy you were allowed, and that was locked up in a cupboard, and only came out for an hour at night. There was no spoiling in my day. No talk of... They just got on with the job.
And those conditions, would you like to relive them and project them into a new generation?
I'm saying we could never touch anything. That's what I'm saying.
So why should children now have more, you mean? Miss Page, you never experienced a family home of your own. You never enjoyed the love, even the affection, of a mother or father. Maternal love is outside your experience. But you saw love for Mrs. Piper growing in the home. You saw it particularly with Tom Rigby, and you hated it. You resented her for bringing something alien into the home, for being able to give love and take it. And when Tom Rigby was punished, you saw this as a blow against her, a blow against this disturbing element that was creeping into the school, against something that you could never understand. I submit that that boy could have been locked up for 48 hours or forever, as far as you were concerned.
That isn't true.
When Mr. Harrison arrived at the school, did you ring Mr. Cardy?
He phoned me.
You sure?
Yes, I'm sure. He said he was coming to unlock the door.
Tell me, Miss Page, why didn't he simply leave the key with you? Yes, I'm not surprised you hesitate, Miss Page. Do you care for any of the children?
Yes, I try.
Miss Page, you don't earn much money in your work, do you?
No, I don't.
So you don't do this job for the money?
No.
No.
Are you all right, Miss Page?
I feel a wee bit faint.
Let her sit down. Bring her a chair. Are you well enough to continue, Miss Page?
Yes.
Thank you. Very well, Mr. Parsons.
So if you don't do this job for the money, Miss Page, you must do it because you care.
Yes, I do.
Is it not true that some 2 weeks before this flooding incident, you went out and spent a considerable amount of money buying clothes and toys for a child newly arrived at the school?
Yes.
Yes, a deprived child.
Both his parents were killed in a car crash.
Yes. Now, why did you do that?
Because he looked so lost.
My lord, I'm about to call as a witness of the defence the boy, Thomas Rigby. I feel, however, I should point out to the court, first of all, that someone suffering from cerebral palsy, the physical effects may appear to the lay member that they are not quite competent to give evidence. I would like to say that Tom Rigby is as intelligent as most people who don't suffer his disability.
This is agreed by all parties, my lord.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm sure the court